After some extended deliberation, it's time for the third annual Thinking Basketball Top 10. The goal of this list is to stack up the strengths and weaknesses of the game's best players for the 2021 season, which hopefully gives you food for thought when thinking about these superstars. For me, best is how much a player helps a team win a championship, so lifting really poor teams to average heights isn't really important. Instead, I place value on skills that move the needle alongside better and better teammates, things like shooting, passing, and defense. It's also really hard to perfectly pinpoint a player's value, so I'll always emphasize ranges. If we held the other players on the list constant, how much would my more optimistic or pessimistic evaluations change their placement? Health also matters to me, especially this season, but we'll get to that at the end. Let's start by assuming that all players are healthy and count down who I think gives a random team the best chance to win a title. At number 10, I have Damian Lillard, who engineered another season of elite offensive play, similar to what I profiled last year in the bubble. Lillard had the best series of his career against Denver, although that did come against a depleted Nuggets backcourt. Dame is one of the better scorers in the game and a prolific playmaker, although he's quietly one of the more ball-dominant players in the NBA, not far off of guys like Luka Doncic and Trae Young in time of possession. Only he doesn't have their high-end passing ability. That makes for a great offensive player, but without elite off-ball movement, I have Lillard a notch below the game's very best attackers. The biggest factor with him is always on the defensive end, which drives down his value compared to offense-only assessments. Dame's pretty clearly a negative in major one-number stats and looks shaky on film, and that is what keeps him just a tier below the 9 big stars ahead of him. That big 9 starts with Luka Doncic, who I have a ton of uncertainty about right now. He ranges from a strong All-NBA player to what I'd consider a strong MVP level player that would move him to 5th. So much of my fuzziness is from his extreme brand of heliocentrism, orchestrating everything through him, which generates huge individual numbers that probably outpace his actual impact. His league-leading offensive load has only been eclipsed by 2 players in NBA history, yet his regular season plus-minus numbers are fairly pedestrian, holding him back in metrics that include plus-minus data. Dallas has only been a smidge better with him on the floor in the last 2 years, although I think a lot of that is strong guard play from players like Tim Hardaway Jr. and Jalen Brunson in Luka's absence. His postseason plus-minus data looks much stronger, although I'd love to see him play a team other than the Clippers before working out just how good this 22-year-old is. He's clearly one of the best playmakers in the world, exerting massive scoring pressure with his size and guile. But does he have any value away from the ball? How good will a Luka offense be without Rick Carlisle coaching? And then there's his defense, which is probably still a negative. The scary thing for the league is that Doncic still has room to grow. I'm just not completely sold on this version as a strong MVP player. At number 8 is a player who keeps gradually improving too, Joel Embiid, who has quietly turned into a Wilt Chamberlain-like scoring machine. When adjusting for inflation, Wilt's famous 1962 numbers are only slightly better than Joel's in 2021, and Embiid's postseason numbers from the last 2 years are quite similar as well. If you're not convinced, here are JoJo's scoring stats over the last 2 years in 19 games he's played without Ben Simmons. The man is a battering ram. In 2021, he took the second most free throws per 100 possessions in NBA history, trailing only Shaquille O'Neal in 2001, and there's no Haka Embiid involved since he shot 86% from the line. Unfortunately, Joel's playmaking still lags way behind his scoring, and while he's slowly developed some basic reads in the last few seasons, he's not good enough to constantly punish teams who overload on him. His defense does make him a pretty steady force, and I think that's one of the reasons he ranks so highly in playoff plus-minus in the last few years. The numbers are still a bit noisy, and he might be vulnerable to pull-up shooters, but he's played a ton of series since 2019 where he's just been a brick wall in the lane. Since then, Philly has given up 10 fewer points per 100 possessions with him on the floor. That sturdy defense actually gives him a higher low-end range than Luka for me, although without more playmaking chops, I have a hard time seeing Embiid higher than 7th right now. At number 7 is James Harden, who, like Doncic, has assaulted the record books with his production, but that heliocentrism has always outpaced his impact. Since 2017, Harden is first in points per game and third in assists per game, but his plus-minus stats also lag a little behind his juicy box numbers. In those 5 years, he was 12th in Ryan Davis's adjusted plus-minus model, and zooming in, the Nets were actually better with him on the bench this year, and while that's from a wonky sample because of all their injuries, KD and Kyrie were better together than when Harden played with either Irving or Durant. I liked Harden's willingness to play a pass-heavy style when all of them were out there for 8 games. You can see his scoring volume falls way off. Although the Nets' efficiency was similar in the 24 games he played with either KD or Kyrie, despite his bump in scoring. In 5 healthy playoff games, the Beard cooked the overmatched Celtics, and his postseason plus-minus data has improved for a number of his prime years. Even with that improvement, his postseason on-off from his final 6 years in Houston would rank 52nd among high-volume players historically. Some of this is just noise, but a lot of it is likely caused by defense, where Harden often looks like a negative or neutral in these kinds of impact stats, and that takes him only as high as 6 for me. Old number 6 is LeBron James, who is hard to place because his ankle injury prevented him from his possible playoff ascension. Age has also sapped his verticality and recovery, so I don't know what he would have looked like without that injury. Remember, LeBron is 36 and coming off a deep playoff run in the bubble. His one playoff series against Phoenix was one of the worst of his career and probably his worst since the 2011 finals, finishing behind almost every series he's played in both box score and plus-minus based estimates. Yet, even in a down year, James sits near the top of the league in most major categories. He's still one of the league's best playmakers, and while he can't stampede to the rim with the same proficiency anymore, he's still a strong scorer. LeBron's free throw rates in that Suns series were the lowest in any series he's played in a decade, and while regression in that area is expected, I think that severe drop-off is evidence of rust after just 2 warm-up games off his ankle injury. Would he have rediscovered his 2020 form with another round under his belt? Or is his body finally wearing down and he was doomed after an abbreviated offseason? Before the injury, he was pretty comfortably a top 5 player, and his history of going Super Saiyan in the playoffs gives me a high-end range all the way up to number 2 for me if he had time to play himself into that shape. On the flip side, maybe what we saw in the playoffs was finally a more mortal version of James, and that would slide him to the back of this pack. Speaking of injuries, Kawhi Leonard's season was cut short by a ligament tear, but he was smoking hot before he went down. Leonard is one of the best scorers we've ever seen, and he has an argument as the game's best scorer right now. You're looking at numbers from the last 3 playoffs, and in 432 minutes in this year's postseason, Kawhi was a whopping 12% better than his opponent's defense in shooting efficiency. Since coming to LA, Kawhi's playmaking has clearly improved to the point where the Clippers have posted a 120 offensive rating with Leonard on the floor and Paul George on the bench. But his passing isn't at the level of LeBron, Luka, or even a few others we'll get to, and that makes him an excellent offensive centerpiece, but not quite an all-timer in that role. I think we see this in playoff plus-minus, where his teams have been better with him off the floor for 6 consecutive series. That's the 4th longest streak since 2001. There's a ton of noise in those samples, but I think this at least suggests his teams haven't completely relied on him. Denver was able to exploit his team defense in 2020, and while I think he's a very good defender, if I thought he still had the claw from 2014 in him, he would be my number 1. Kawhi's impact metrics in the playoffs are still very strong, especially in the box score, and I see an argument for him up at number 2 this year, just barely short of number 1. I actually thought about placing him 4th instead of Kevin Durant. Let's go back to that scoring graphic a moment ago. Durant is the only player in the last 3 seasons with numbers I'd call comfortably better than Kawhi's in the playoffs, and since 2017, their scoring numbers are extremely similar. As good as Kawhi is as a shooter, I think Durant is better, both as a mid-range practitioner and from behind the line. And he's also a slightly better playmaker as a primary option. One specific edge he has is on corner passes, and KD's more dangerous away from the ball, playing off of other primary weapons. Kawhi can put a little more pressure on the rim because Durant has lost a little as a penetrator, but Kevin's also improved as a shooter in the last few seasons. Since leaving Oklahoma City, he shot a mind-melting 52% on his long twos, the highest percentage of any 4-year stretch on record since 1997. Despite his Achilles injury, Durant's defense is only slightly weaker to me than at his peak, providing some rim protection in Brooklyn's small ball lineups. That two-way package fits with so many elite teams that my high-end evaluation would be just enough to take him to number 1. The second player with a good claim to the top spot is the MVP, Nikola Jokic. Earlier this year, I broke down Jokic's claim as the best offensive big man ever, and not much changed for me in the playoffs. The simplest way to convey how historically unique Jokic is to note that he's at the top of the league in post offense and mid-range shooting, makes 39% of his threes, and is arguably the best passer on the planet. I only have a little uncertainty about the Joker because he recently ascended, then played the 2021 postseason without most of his regular cutters and shooters. He fared quite well without Jamal Murray this season, turning into a scoring machine while keeping Denver's offense in the upper stratosphere. He was easily the best regular season player, according to just about all the impact metrics, and that box score number is a top 5 peak in my model going back to 1955.
1955?
But his playoff numbers aren't quite there yet, and some of that might just be injuries to teammates, or it might be his questionable defense. Jokic has actually been around neutral or slightly positive in these kinds of defensive estimates in the playoffs, but Denver has had issues as a team, and taking up one of the key defensive positions with a mediocre defensive center makes it harder to construct great two-way lineups. It's not a huge deal to me. There's no reason average defensive teams can't win with great offense, but if I thought Jokic were a clear positive on defense, he'd be the best player in the world for me. That's completely different than building around Giannis Antetokounmpo, one of the game's best defenders who brings a ton of two-way value. I detailed Giannis' defensive versatility last year, and that was on display again in the playoffs as the Bucks manufactured one of the stingiest defensive runs in postseason history. Antetokounmpo's ability to enhance a drop coverage scheme and spearhead more switchable tactics makes him a great defensive anchor in today's game. Attempts to measure playoff defense give him a top 5 or at worst top 10 peak on that end since 2014. I find his offense a bit trickier to untangle depending on his role. His insistence on shooting threes and his lack of versatility in isolation hurts his on-ball game as a primary offensive engine. The Bucks adjusted to this as the playoffs unfolded, for instance isolating him from the wing instead of the middle of the floor. But even with those changes, I don't think he's a great clear-cut number 1 option. Milwaukee's playoff offense was only in the 17th percentile among teams making deep runs historically, and the 3rd worst offense among title winners in the shot clock era relative to opposing defenses. I think Giannis is more optimized playing away from the ball, both as a roll man and offensive rebounder, while also attacking hard in transition. That's a very good but not great offensive package, which is enough to give him a strong argument as the league's best player for the 3rd consecutive year. Even my lower perspective still keeps him in the top 5 because of that prolific rim pressure and defensive impact. And at number 1, that leaves Steph Curry. Many people balk at Curry here, but I'm actually most comfortable placing him among the league's 2 or 3 best players simply because he's such an unprecedented offensive force. He's not quite as quick as he was 4 or 5 years ago, and the league has also caught up to him as well. But his additional tricks and sturdier frame just authored another monstrous offensive season. Curry's one-number metrics don't look like outliers in 2021, but this was a tale of 2 seasons for me. The Warriors first experimenting with grooming James Wiseman, and then unleashing the Human Torch. With Wiseman and Draymond Green in the lineup, Golden State was only a .500 team with a negative offense in 32 games. In 28 games without Wiseman, they played at a 60-win pace with a top 10 offense. Curry's impact numbers were night and day, going from an all-NBA type of footprint with Wiseman to what would be the 15th best peak ever in my box model. His scoring numbers in those 28 games would make Michael Jordan jealous. An unholy 37 points per 75 on shooting 11% ahead of the league while making 7 threes a game. Here's what that looks like adjusted for inflation against every scoring season in NBA history. By the way, that outlier right there is Steph Curry's 2016. My biggest question with Steph is actually how much his defense has slipped, since he was never a very good defender in the first place. I view him as a very minor negative on that end, losing a bit of quickness and motor off of his peak. Even with that, his freakish combination of scoring and court-warping gravity is good enough to keep him at the top of the league, in my estimation. I do think he would have worn down in a longer playoff run, and so when we consider health, I'd drop him behind the sturdier Jokic. Remember, Giannis missed playoff time for the 2nd straight year too, so he'd be 3rd. Kawhi's ACL bumps him out, and Luka jumps over Harden and Embiid, neither of whom could hold up completely in the playoffs. For that final spot, I considered Rudy Gobert, who gets way too much flack for his guards not being able to stop penetration, and I also think Jimmy Butler or Jason Tatum are again in this conversation. But I'm going to give the number 10 spot to Paul George this year. He was quietly really good, and I like him as an offensive number 2 better than the other candidates. That is it for 2021. Let me know your thoughts down below. There are links to deeper dives on all these players in the description box. A big thanks to Crumple Jumper for the incredible player art in these videos. If you want to support this channel and get more content, sign up at patreon.com/thinkingbasketball. And if you are still watching, I am so grateful for your support that makes this channel possible. And as always, I hope that you are having a great day.